The blue stains on her fingers never quite faded, no matter how much she scrubbed, and Jorin Thane had long since stopped trying to hide them when she ventured into the village for supplies. She stood now in the small yard behind the dye house, working lye soap between her palms over a wooden basin, watching the water turn pale indigo as the woad leached out of the creases of her knuckles. Her grandmother was inside, dozing in the chair by the window, and the afternoon sun slanted through the apple trees that marked the boundary between their cottage and the fields beyond. Jorin rehearsed the words under her breath for perhaps the 20th time that day, shaping them carefully with her lips, trying to make them sound natural and easy instead of stilted and strange. Thank you for mending the fence. Thank you for fixing the shutters. Thank you for replacing the boards on the porch. She tried each variation, her voice barely above a whisper, her small tusks clicking softly against her lower lip. The words felt foreign in her mouth, too bold, too presumptuous. What if he thought she was asking for more? What if he misunderstood? What if he laughed? She had been watching Marcus Reed work around their property for nearly a month now, ever since the spring storm had torn half the thatch from their roof and cracked 2 of the support beams in the drying shed. He had appeared the morning after the storm, a tall man with sun-darkened skin and work-roughened hands, carrying tools and timber, and he had simply started fixing things. Her grandmother had come out to ask what he wanted, suspicion sharp in her old eyes, but he had only touched his cap and said that he had noticed the damage, and that it seemed wrong to let it stand when he had the time and the skill to set it right. That had been 4 weeks ago. Since then, Marcus had come every few days, sometimes every day, arriving in the early morning or the late afternoon when his own farm work allowed. He mended the fence where the posts had rotted through. He replaced the cracked window in the dye house. He rebuilt the steps to the cellar. He never asked for payment. He never lingered longer than the work required. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low and kind, and he looked at Jorin as though she were simply another person, not a monster or a curiosity or a problem to be solved. It unnerved her. It also made something warm and bright kindle in her chest, something she had no name for and did not quite trust. Today he was bringing a new copper kettle to replace the one that had sprung a leak last winter. Jorin had mentioned it in passing, more to herself than to anyone else, while Marcus was working on the drying racks in the yard. She had not expected him to do anything about it. Copper kettles were expensive, far beyond what a small dye house could afford, and she had resigned herself to making do with the patched iron pot that gave the cloth an uneven color. But 2 days ago, Marcus had told her that he would be going to the market town and that he would see what he could find. She had not asked him to. She had not expected him to. And now he was coming back, and she owed him thanks, and she could not seem to find the right words. Jorin dried her hands on her apron and glanced toward the lane. The sun was low enough that he would be arriving soon if he was coming at all. She tried another rehearsal, pitching her voice a little louder, trying to sound confident. "Thank you, Marcus. You have been very kind. We are grateful." Better. That sounded better. She could say that. She could meet his eyes and say those words and then retreat back into the house before she embarrassed herself. She heard his footsteps on the path before she saw him, the steady crunch of boots on gravel, and her heart gave a nervous flutter. She wiped her hands on her apron again, even though they were already dry, and turned to face the gate. Marcus appeared a moment later, a large bundle wrapped in canvas slung over one shoulder, and when he saw her, he smiled. It was a small smile, almost shy, and it did something strange to her breathing. "Good evening, Jorin," he said, setting the bundle down carefully on the ground. He unwrapped it to reveal a copper kettle, broad and deep, its surface gleaming dully in the fading light. It was not new, but it was whole and sound, and it was easily 3 times the size of the one she had been using. Jorin stared at it. She opened her mouth to deliver her carefully rehearsed thank you, but the words tangled on her tongue. Marcus was looking at her, his expression open and expectant, and all she could think was that he had spent his own money on this, that he had gone out of his way to find it, that he had carried it all the way from the market town, and that he was doing it for her. For her. A shy orc woman who could barely speak to him without stammering, who lived on the edge of the village with her failing grandmother, who had nothing to offer him in return. "I thought this might serve you better than the old one," Marcus said, his voice gentle. The tinker in the market town said it would hold heat well, and the copper should not affect the dye the way iron does. Jorin nodded mutely. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, a flush that darkened her green skin. She took a step forward, intending to kneel and examine the kettle, to thank him properly, to say something, anything, that would convey the gratitude that was swelling in her chest. But instead, she found herself standing directly in front of him, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of hay and sun-warmed cotton that clung to his shirt. And then, before she could stop herself, before she could think or reason or remember all the careful words she had practiced, Jorin leaned up on her toes and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, startled and clumsy, her lips brushing against his in a way that was more collision than caress. For one heartbeat, Marcus froze, his eyes going wide, and then Jorin realized what she had done. Horror flooded through her, cold and sharp, and she jerked back, spun on her heel, and bolted for the house. She heard Marcus call her name, but she did not stop. She flew through the back door, past her grandmother who was just waking from her nap, and up the narrow stairs to the room under the eaves that had been hers since childhood. She slammed the door behind her and pressed her back against it, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. What had she done? What had she been thinking? She had kissed him. She had kissed Marcus Raid, the kind human farmer who had been helping them out of pure generosity, and now he would think she was forward or desperate or worse. He would never come back. He would tell people in the village. They would laugh at her. They already thought she was strange, the orc girl who kept to herself and dyed cloth and never spoke unless spoken to. And now she had given them something real to whisper about. Jorin slid down to sit on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, and buried her face in her hands. The blue stains on her fingers stood out starkly against her green skin, and she wished, not for the first time, that she were someone else entirely. Downstairs, she heard her grandmother's voice, low and questioning, and then Marcus's reply, too faint to make out the words. Jorin squeezed her eyes shut and tried to will herself to disappear. The next morning, Jorin did not come downstairs until she heard Marcus's footsteps retreating down the lane. She had spent the night lying awake, staring at the sloped ceiling, replaying the kiss over and over in her mind until the memory was worn smooth and painful. When dawn finally came, she crept down to the kitchen and found her grandmother sitting at the table, a cup of tea steaming in front of her. "He left the kettle," her grandmother said without preamble. Her name was Jorin Thane, and she had the same green skin and small tusks as Jorin, though age had softened her features and turned her hair to iron gray. "It is in the dye house. He also left a sack of oats and some eggs from his hens." Jorin said nothing. She busied herself with the fire, adding wood and stirring the coals, keeping her back to her grandmother. "He asked after you," Greta continued. "I told him you were unwell." "Thank you," Jorin murmured. "He said he would come back tomorrow to finish the work on the shed roof." I told him that was not necessary, but he said he had already started and he did not like to leave a job half done. Jorin closed her eyes. Of course he was coming back. Of course he was. Because Marcus Reed was a good man, a kind man, and he would not let one awkward, mortifying kiss drive him away from work that needed doing, which meant she would have to face him eventually. She would have to look him in the eye and apologize and try to explain that she had not meant anything by it, that it had been a mistake, an impulse, a moment of madness brought on by too much gratitude and too little sense. The thought made her stomach turn. She spent the day in the dye house, preparing a batch of woad. It was familiar, soothing work, and she lost herself in the rhythm of it, fermenting the leaves, skimming the scum, adding the lye, watching the color bloom in the water. The new copper kettle sat on the workbench, gleaming in the afternoon light, and every time Jorin looked at it, she felt a fresh wave of shame. The next morning, she heard Marcus arrive just after dawn. She stayed inside the dye house, her hands submerged in a vat of indigo, her heart beating too fast. She heard the sound of his ladder scraping against the side of the shed, the tap of his hammer, the creak of boards being pried loose and replaced. She stayed where she was. Greta came out an hour later, leaning heavily on her cane, and crossed the yard to speak with him. Jorin could not hear what they said, but she saw her grandmother gesture toward the dye house, and she saw Marcus nod. A few minutes later, Greta returned and pushed open the door. "You cannot hide from him forever," Greta said. "I am not hiding, I am working." "You are being a coward." Jorin flinched. She pulled her hands from the vat and wiped them on a rag, not looking at her grandmother. "I embarrassed him. I embarrassed myself. It is better if I stay out of his way." "Did he seem embarrassed to you?" Jorin did not answer. Greta sighed. She lowered herself onto the stool by the door, wincing as her joints protested. "He is a good man, Jorin. He does not seem the type to hold one awkward moment against you. But if you never speak to him, if you never explain, he will think you regret it, or worse, that you are afraid of him." "I do regret it." "Do you?" Jorin opened her mouth to say yes, of course she did, but the word stuck in her throat. Because the truth, the uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, was that she did not regret the kiss itself. She regretted the way it had happened, the way she had fled, the way she had let fear and shame swallow her whole. But the kiss, the brief, startled press of her lips against his, the way his eyes had gone wide, the way he had smelled like summer and safety. No, she did not regret that. On the third day, Jorin finally worked up the courage to leave the dye house while Marcus was still there. She had prepared a speech, something simple and straightforward that would let her apologize and move on, but when she stepped out into the yard and saw him up on the roof, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair damp with sweat, all her carefully chosen words evaporated. He saw her and paused, his hammer in hand, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then he climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his trousers, and crossed the yard to meet her. "Hello, Jorin," he said quietly. "Hello." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I am glad to see you are feeling better. Your grandmother said you were unwell." "I was not unwell. I was hiding." The honesty of it seemed to surprise him. He blinked, and then a slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I thought as much." "I am sorry," Jorin said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I should not have kissed you. It was inappropriate. I meant to say thank you for the kettle and for all the work you have done, and instead I did not mean to make you uncomfortable. I understand if you do not want to come back." Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he said, "Did it make you uncomfortable?" Jorin blinked. "What? The kiss, did it make you uncomfortable? I know." "Yes, I do not know." She twisted her hands together, feeling the blue stains rough under her fingers. I was embarrassed. I am still embarrassed. I do not usually, I have never, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I was surprised, Marcus said, but I was not uncomfortable, or upset, or anything else you might be worrying about. Jorin stared at him. You were not? No. He hesitated, then added, if anything, I was worried that I had done something to make you run away, that I had overstepped somehow. You did not. You have been nothing but kind. Then perhaps we can agree that it was a moment of impulse, and that no harm was done, and that we need not speak of it again unless you wish to. Jorin felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety unraveling. You would still come back. Even after I told your grandmother I would finish the roof, and I will, and there are a few other things I noticed that could use attention if you do not mind. We cannot pay you. I have not asked you to. But why? The question burst out of her, edged with frustration. Why do you keep helping us? What do you want? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. Then he said, when I came back from the war 3 years ago, I was not in a good way. I had a farm, but I could barely bring myself to work it. I had neighbors, but I could not stand to be around them. I was angry and bitter and half convinced I should have died with the rest of my company. And then one day, old Matthias from the next farm over showed up at my door with a basket of bread and cheese and told me he was going to sit on my porch until I ate something. He did that every day for a month, never asked for anything, never tried to fix me. Just showed up and made sure I was still breathing. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Matthias died last winter. Heart gave out in his sleep. I never got the chance to thank him properly, to tell him that he was the reason I did not give up. So when I saw your roof torn up and your fence falling apart, I thought, well, maybe I could be that for someone else. Maybe I could show up and make sure you and your grandmother were all right. That is all. Jorin felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them back, swallowing hard. Thank you, she managed, for telling me and for everything. Marcus smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. You are welcome, Jorin, and for what it is worth, I did not mind the kiss. It was not the worst way to be thanked. Despite herself, Jorin felt a smile tugging at her lips. It was not the best way either. Perhaps not, but it was memorable. And with that, the tension between them broke. Jorin found herself laughing, a startled, breathless sound, and Marcus grinned at her, and for the first time in 3 days she felt as though she could breathe again. Over the following weeks, a new rhythm settled over the Dye house. Marcus came every few days, always bringing something small. A sack of meal, a handful of early strawberries, a bundle of kindling. He finished the roof on the shed and moved on to other projects, repairing the gate, reinforcing the well cover, building a new frame for the drying racks. Jorin worked in the Dye house, her hands perpetually stained blue or red or yellow depending on the day, and slowly, carefully, she began to speak to him. It was easier than she had expected. Marcus had a way of asking questions that did not feel intrusive, and he listened when she answered, his attention steady and unhurried. She told him about the Dye house, about the plants she used and the colors they made, about the way woad needed time to ferment and madder needed heat and weld needed patience. He asked her how she had learned the craft, and she told him about her grandmother, who had been teaching her since she was a child, and about her mother, who had died when Jorin was young and who had been the finest dyer in 3 counties. In turn, Marcus told her about his farm, a small holding on the other side of the village where he grew oats and barley and kept a few chickens and a milk cow. He told her about the war, though not in detail, only enough for her to understand that he had been a soldier and that it had marked him in ways that still lingered. He told her about Matthias, about the way the old man had sat on his porch and talked about nothing in particular, about weather and crops, and the way the light looked on the hills in the evening. Greta watched them from the window, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and occasionally she would make remarks that were pointed enough to make Jorin blush and Marcus clear his throat. But she did not disapprove, and that, more than anything, gave Jorin hope. Summer deepened. The garden behind the dye house, filled with the plants Jorin used for her work, woad and madder and weld, tansy and coreopsis, pokeberry and black walnut. She spent long days harvesting and preparing, her hands moving with practiced ease, her mind occupied with the endless small decisions that dyeing required. Marcus helped when he could, learning to strip leaves and pound roots and stir the vats without splashing, and Jorin found that she liked having him there, that the dye house felt less lonely with his presence. One afternoon in late June, as they were working together to strain a batch of madder, Marcus said, "There is a midsummer dance in the village next week. I was wondering if you would like to go." Jorin nearly dropped the straining cloth. She looked up at him, her heart giving a nervous jump. "To the dance?" "Yes. With me, I mean, if you would like." Jorin hesitated. She had never been to a village dance. She had never been invited. The thought of standing in the square with all those people, all those eyes on her, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But the thought of saying no, of disappointing Marcus, was somehow worse. "I do not dance," she said finally. "Neither do I, not well, but I thought it might be nice to go anyway, to listen to the music, to see people. They will stare. Perhaps. Does that bother you?" "Yes." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we will not go, but I want you to know that I would be proud to stand beside you, Jorin, no matter who is watching." The words settled into her chest, warm and solid, and Jorin found herself blinking back tears for the second time since meeting him. "I will think about it," she whispered. "That is all I ask." In the end, Jorin did not go to the dance, but Marcus did not seem disappointed. He came the next day as usual, and he did not mention it again, and Jorin felt a rush of gratitude so intense it left her breathless. It was 2 days later that the letter arrived. Greta brought it into the dye house, her hands shaking slightly as she held it out. The wax seal bore the mark of the Ashford family, one of the wealthiest in the region, and Jorin's heart sank even before she broke it open. Inside was a commission. A midsummer trousseau for the Ashford daughter, who was to be married in August. 12 lengths of cloth dyed in specific colors: deep indigo, bright scarlet, saffron yellow, soft rose, rich green, and a purple so dark it was almost black. The price offered was generous, far more than the dye house usually earned in a season, and there was a note at the bottom stating that the commission was contingent on the cloth being delivered by the 1st of August, in time for the wedding. Jorin read the letter twice, her mind racing. The commission was enormous. It was also their only chance to renew the lease on the cottage, which was due at the end of summer. Without it, they would have to leave to find somewhere else to live, and Greta was too old and too frail to start over. But the timeline was tight. 6 weeks to produce 12 lengths of cloth, each one dyed perfectly, each one meeting the exacting standards of a family like the Ashfords. It was possible, but only just, and only if nothing went wrong. "We have to take it," Jorin said, looking up at her grandmother. Greta nodded. "I know. I will need to start immediately. I will need to order supplies. I know, child. We will manage." Jorin folded the letter carefully and set it on the workbench. Her hands were trembling. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the chance to prove that the dye house was viable, that she and her grandmother could survive on their own. But it was also terrifying, a weight of expectation that settled over her shoulders like a yoke. She told Marcus about the commission the next time he came. He listened carefully, his expression thoughtful, and when she finished, he said, "That is a lot of work for one person. I can manage. I am sure you can, but if you need help, you only have to ask. You have your own farm to run. The oats can wait. You cannot." Jorin wanted to argue, to tell him that she did not need his help, that she could do this on her own. But the truth was that she was already exhausted just thinking about the work ahead, and the idea of having someone to share the burden, someone who would not judge or criticize or expect perfection, was almost unbearably tempting. "I will let you know," she said finally. "Good." Jorin threw herself into the work. She ordered wool and linen from the weavers in the village, haggling over prices and quality until she was satisfied. She prepared her vats, cleaning and repairing and checking each one for leaks or cracks. She gathered her plants, harvesting the woad and madder and weld at the peak of their potency, drying and storing them with meticulous care. She worked from dawn until long after dark, her hands moving constantly, her mind focused entirely on the task ahead. Marcus came every day. He helped her carry water from the well, chop wood for the fires, stir the vats when her arms grew tired. He learned to test the temperature of the dye by touch, to judge the depth of color by eye, to handle the delicate cloth without tearing or staining it. He did not talk much while they worked, but his presence was steady and reassuring, and Jorin found herself relying on him more than she had expected. Greta watched from the house, too weak to help, but still sharp enough to offer advice. She told Jorin which mordants to use for which colors, how long to soak the cloth, when to add the fixatives. She told Marcus which plants to avoid, which tools to clean, how to keep the fires at the right temperature. Her voice was hoarse and her hands shook, but her mind was as clear as ever, and Jorin felt a pang of gratitude every time her grandmother spoke. The first length of cloth came out of the indigo vat perfect, a deep, even blue that seemed to glow in the sunlight. Jorin held it up, checking for streaks or blotches, and when she found none, she felt a rush of relief so intense it made her dizzy. "One down," Marcus said, smiling at her. 11 to go. We will get there." But the next batch was harder. The scarlet dye required madder root, and the process was finicky, demanding precise temperatures and careful timing. Jorin spent 2 days preparing the vat, adjusting the heat, testing and retesting the color, and when she finally submerged the cloth, she held her breath and prayed. The cloth came out streaked, not badly but enough that it would not meet the Ashford standards. Jorin stared at it, her heart sinking, and then she crumpled it in her hands and threw it into the corner. "It is ruined," she said, her voice shaking. "I will have to start over. I will have to order more wool. I do not have time, Jorin." Marcus's voice was calm, steady. He crossed the dye house and took her hands in his, stilling their trembling. "It is not ruined. We can fix it. You do not understand. It has to be perfect. If it is not perfect, they will not accept it. If they do not accept it, we lose the commission. If we lose the commission, we will not lose the commission. I promise you we will not." He squeezed her hands gently. "But you need to breathe. You need to rest. You have been working yourself to exhaustion, and it is affecting your judgment. I do not have time to rest. Then make time, just for an hour, just long enough to clear your head." Jorin wanted to argue, but she was so tired, and Marcus's hands were warm and solid around hers, and she found herself nodding before she could think better of it. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour. They sat in the shade of the apple trees, a pitcher of cool water between them, and for the first time in days, Jorin let herself stop. She closed her eyes and listened to the rustle of leaves, the hum of bees, the distant sound of Marcus's breathing beside her. The knot of anxiety in her chest did not disappear, but it loosened, just a little, and when she opened her eyes again, the world felt a fraction less overwhelming. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You do not have to thank me. I do. You have done so much for us, for me. I do not know how I would manage without you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I like being here, Jorin. I like working with you. I like the way you talk about colors as though they have personalities. I like the way your hands move when you are stirring the vats, like you are conducting music. I like the way you frown when you are concentrating, and the way you smile when something comes out right. I like all of it." Jorin's breath caught. She turned to look at him, and the expression on his face was so open, so earnest that it made her chest ache. "Marcus, I am not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know, in case you were wondering why I keep coming back." Jorin swallowed hard. "I like having you here," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I like the way you listen, and the way you never make me feel foolish, and the way you look at me as though I am worth looking at. I like all of it, too." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with something Jorin could not name. Then Marcus smiled, slow and warm, and said, "Well then, I suppose we are in agreement." "I suppose we are." They returned to the dye house, and Jorin felt lighter than she had in days. Together, they salvaged the scarlet cloth, over-dyeing it until the streaks disappeared and the color deepened to a rich, even red. It took the rest of the day and most of the night, but when they were done, Jorin held up the cloth and knew it was perfect. The work continued. Saffron yellow from weld, soft rose from a blend of madder and weld, rich green from a combination of woad and weld, and the elusive deep purple from a careful layering of indigo and madder. Each color had its own challenges, its own demands, and Jorin met them with grim determination, Marcus always at her side. Greta grew weaker. She spent more and more time in her chair by the window, her breathing shallow, her hands too unsteady to hold a cup without spilling. Jorin tried not to worry, tried to focus on the work, but every time she looked at her grandmother, she felt a cold knot of fear settle in her stomach. "She is dying," Marcus said quietly one evening when Greta had fallen asleep and they were alone in the dye house. "I know." Jorin's voice was flat, emotionless. "But not yet. Not until this is finished." "Jorin, not yet," she repeated, and Marcus did not press her. It was 3 weeks into the commission when disaster struck. Jorin was preparing a new batch of indigo, working with one of the older vats when she heard a sharp crack. She looked up just in time to see the bottom of the vat give way, and then boiling water and dye were pouring out, splashing across the floor, across her legs, across her hands. She screamed. The pain was immediate and searing, a white-hot agony that drove her to her knees. Marcus was beside her in an instant, hauling her up, dragging her to the water barrel, plunging her hands into the cold water. She was sobbing, gasping, her vision blurring with tears, and through it all she could hear Marcus's voice, low and urgent, telling her to breathe, telling her it would be all right. He carried her into the house and laid her on the kitchen table. Greta was there, moving with a speed Jorin had not seen in months, her hands steady as she examined the burns. The skin on Jorin's hands was red and blistered, already beginning to swell, and when Greta touched it, Jorin bit down on a scream. "Cold compresses," Greta said sharply. "And fetch the salve from the shelf, the one with the comfrey. Quickly." Marcus moved like a man possessed. He soaked cloths in cold water and wrapped them around Jorin's hands, his own hands shaking. He found the salve and brought it to Greta, who applied it with careful, practiced strokes, murmuring reassurances all the while. The pain did not lessen, but it became bearable, and Jorin finally stopped sobbing, her breath coming in ragged, hitching gasps. "You will not be able to use your hands for at least a month," Greta said, her voice grim. "Maybe longer. The burns are deep. If they become infected, I know." Jorin's voice was hoarse. "I know. The commission is over. We cannot deliver it if I cannot work. No." Marcus's voice was firm, cutting through the despair that was threatening to swallow Jorin whole. "It is not over. I will do it." Jorin stared at him. "You do not know how. Then you will teach me. You can tell me what to do and I will do it. We still have 3 weeks. We can finish this." "Marcus, you do not understand. Dying is not just following instructions. It is a skill. It takes years to learn. You cannot. I can try." He looked at her, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with determination. "You have worked too hard to give up now. Your grandmother is counting on you. I am not going to let you lose this because of an accident." Greta made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. "The boy is stubborn. You should listen to him." Jorin looked from Marcus to her grandmother and back again. The pain in her hands was a constant, throbbing presence, and the thought of trying to guide Marcus through the intricate, demanding work of dying made her want to weep. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was losing the commission, losing the cottage, watching her grandmother die without a roof over her head. "All right," she whispered. "All right, we will try." The next 6 weeks were the hardest of Jorin's life. She sat on a stool in the dye house, her hands wrapped in bandages, her voice hoarse from talking, and guided Marcus through every step of the process. She told him when to add the mordant and when to stir the vat. She told him how to test the temperature and how to judge the color. She told him when to pull the cloth and when to rinse it, when to wring it, and when to hang it to dry. Marcus worked with a focus and intensity that took her breath away. He made mistakes. Of course everyone did, but he learned from them, adjusting and adapting, his hands growing more confident with each passing day. He asked questions constantly, his mind hungry for knowledge, and Jorin found herself explaining not just the how but the why, the science and the art that underpinned every decision she made. It was intimate in a way she had not expected. Her voice in his ear, his hands following her instructions, the two of them working in tandem to create something beautiful. She watched the way his shoulders tensed when he was uncertain, the way his mouth quirked when he got something right, the way he looked at her for reassurance before every major step. And slowly, without quite realizing it, she began to trust him not just with the work, but with everything. Greta watched from her chair, offering the occasional comment or correction, but mostly she was silent, her gaze distant. Jorin knew her grandmother was slipping away, that each day brought her closer to the end, and the knowledge was a constant ache in her chest. But there was no time to grieve, no time to prepare. There was only the work and Marcus and the hope that they could finish in time. The cloth began to accumulate. 6 lengths, then 8, then 10. Each one was perfect, or as close to perfect as they could manage, and Jorin felt a fierce, irrational pride every time she looked at them. This was her work, her skill, her legacy, and Marcus had helped her bring it to life. It was the 11th length that nearly broke them. The purple was proving impossible, the color never quite right, always too red or too blue or too faint. Jorin talked Marcus through 3 attempts, and each time the cloth came out wrong. She could see the frustration building in him, the way his jaw tightened and his movements grew jerky, and she knew he was close to giving up. "Stop," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Stop and breathe." Marcus set down the stirring rod and turned to face her, his chest heaving. "I do not know what I am doing wrong." "You are not doing anything wrong. Purple is the hardest color. It requires patience and precision and a little bit of luck. We will get it right. We do not have time for more attempts. The deadline is in 5 days. Then we will work through the night. We will work until we get it right, but you cannot panic. If you panic, you will make mistakes, and mistakes will ruin the cloth. Trust me, trust the process, it will work. Marcus took a deep breath, then another. All right, he said finally. All right, walk me through it again. They worked through the night and into the next day, adjusting ratios and temperatures, testing and retesting until Jorin's voice was raw and Marcus's hands were cramping. And then, finally, the cloth came out of the vat a deep, rich purple, dark as a bruise, perfect as a jewel. Marcus held it up, and for a moment he just stared at it, his expression stunned. We did it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We did it, Jorin agreed, and then she was crying, tears streaming down her face, her bandaged hands pressed to her mouth. Marcus set down the cloth and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms, and she let herself collapse against him, sobbing with relief and exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to joy. The 12th length was finished 2 days later. Jorin inspected each piece of cloth with a critical eye, checking for flaws, for uneven dye, for anything that might give the Ashfords cause to reject the commission. She found nothing. The cloth was perfect, every piece a testament to her skill and Marcus's determination, and when she finally set down the last length, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Now we deliver it, Marcus said. The Ashford estate was a half-day's journey from the village, a sprawling manor house surrounded by gardens and orchards. Marcus drove the cart, the cloth carefully wrapped and stacked in the back, and Jorin sat beside him, her hands still bandaged but healing. Greta had insisted on staying behind, too weak to make the journey, and Jorin had kissed her grandmother's forehead before leaving, whispering a promise that she would be back soon. The steward who met them at the gate was a thin, pinch-faced man named Aldrich, and he looked at Jorin with undisguised disdain. "You are the dyer," he said, his tone skeptical. "I am," Jorin said, keeping her voice steady. "I was expecting someone else. The letter was signed by Greta Thane." "My grandmother, she is unwell. I completed the commission." Aldrich's eyes flicked to her bandaged hands and his lip curled. "And him," he gestured at Marcus, "he assisted me. I see." Aldrich turned his attention to the cart, lifting the corner of one of the wrappings to examine the cloth beneath. He was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "This is not what I expected." Jorin's heart sank. "Is there a problem with the quality?" "The quality is acceptable. However, given the circumstances, I believe the price should be renegotiated. Half the agreed amount seems more appropriate, considering the work was not done by the dyer listed in the contract." Jorin stared at him, her mind reeling. Half the price would not be enough to renew the lease. It would barely be enough to cover the cost of supplies. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. "That is unacceptable," Marcus said, his voice hard. "The contract specified 12 lengths of cloth in specific colors, delivered by the 1st of August. The cloth is here. It is perfect. The identity of the dyer is irrelevant." "The identity is entirely relevant," Aldrich said, his tone icy. "I commissioned work from a known craftsman, not a—" he paused, his gaze raking over Jorin, "not an orc girl and her farmhand." Jorin felt as though she had been struck. The words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not breathe. Marcus stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Jorin caught his arm, holding him back. "I dyed this cloth," she said, her voice shaking. "I designed the colors. I prepared the vats. I supervised every step. The fact that my hands were burned, and I could not physically do the work, does not change the fact that it is my work. And if you refuse to honor the contract, I will make sure every dyer and weaver and merchant in this region knows that the Ashford family cheats their craftsmen." Aldrich's face went red. You would not dare try me." For a long moment they stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Then a voice called from the house, light and imperious. "Aldrich, what is taking so long?" A young woman appeared on the steps, blonde and beautiful and dressed in a gown that probably cost more than Jorin would earn in a year. She looked at the cart, at Jorin, at Marcus, and then at the steward, her expression curious. "Is this the dyer?" she asked. "Yes, my lady," Aldrich said stiffly. The young woman, Lady Catherine Ashford, Jorin assumed, descended the steps and crossed to the cart. She lifted one of the cloths, holding it up to the light, and her eyes widened. "This is extraordinary," she said. "The color is perfect, exactly what I asked for." "My lady, there has been a complication," Aldrich began, but Lady Catherine waved him off. "I do not care about complications. This is the finest work I have seen. Pay her the full amount." "But the full amount, Aldrich, and add a bonus. This deserves to be rewarded." Aldrich's mouth thinned, but he nodded. "As you wish, my lady." Lady Catherine turned to Jorin, her smile warm. "Thank you. This will make my wedding day even more special. I am grateful." Jorin managed a nod, her throat too tight for words. Lady Catherine swept back into the house, and Aldrich grudgingly counted out the payment, adding an extra 10 silver coins on top. Jorin took the money with shaking hands, hardly daring to believe it was real. They did not speak on the journey home. Jorin clutched the purse of coins to her chest, her mind racing, and Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his expression grim. It was only when they reached the dye house, when Marcus helped her down from the cart, and she stumbled and he caught her, that she finally broke. "I spoke," she said, her voice wondering. "I spoke for myself in front of all those people, and I did not run." Marcus smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You did. You were magnificent." Jorin laughed, a breathless, incredulous sound. And then she was kissing him, properly this time, her bandaged hands framing his face, her lips sure and steady against his. Marcus kissed her back, his arms coming around her, pulling her close, and for a long, perfect moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words quiet and certain. "I have loved you since the day you kissed me and ran away, and I will love you for the rest of my life if you will let me." "I will let you," Jorin whispered. "I love you too." They went inside to tell Greta, and the old woman smiled, her eyes bright with tears, and said that it was about time. The lease was renewed the next day, paid in full with enough left over to see them through the winter. Greta's health did not improve, but it did not worsen either, and Jorin counted that as a victory. Summer gave way to autumn. Jorin's hands healed slowly, the scars pale against her green skin, and she returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus spent more and more time at the dye house, his own farm tended in the early mornings and late evenings, and gradually, without any formal discussion, his presence became a permanent fixture. In September, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting in the yard, watching the sun set over the fields, and he took her hand and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you have me?" Jorin said yes without hesitation, and they were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in the village square, with Greta as the witness. Jorin wore a dress dyed the deep indigo of her first successful batch, the color rich and even, and Marcus wore a shirt she had dyed a soft, warm brown. The villagers came, more out of curiosity than goodwill, but Jorin did not care. She stood beside Marcus, her hand in his, and felt as though she were exactly where she was meant to be. The autumn cloth fair was held in the market town in late October, and Jorin entered a length of her purple cloth, the same deep, perfect shade she and Marcus had fought so hard to achieve. She did not expect to win. The competition was fierce, the other entrants skilled and experienced, and she was still an orc woman in a human world, still someone most people would rather ignore. But when the judges announced the winner, when they called her name and held up her cloth for everyone to see, Jorin felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She walked to the front of the pavilion, her legs shaking, and accepted the ribbon with trembling hands. The crowd applauded, and she looked out at them, at all those human faces, and saw not hostility but respect. Marcus was waiting for her at the edge of the pavilion, his face alight with pride, and when she reached him, she did not hesitate. She kissed him, deliberately, in front of everyone, and she did not run. She stayed, her hand in his, her heart full, and she let the world see that she was no longer afraid. They walked through the fair together, hand in hand, and Jorin felt as though she were walking through a dream. People stopped to congratulate her, to ask about her work, to place orders for future commissions. Marcus stayed at her side, his presence steady and reassuring, and every time she faltered, he squeezed her hand and smiled, and she found the courage to keep going. That night, they returned to the cottage, where Greta was waiting by the fire. Jorin showed her the ribbon, and the old woman held it gently, running her fingers over the silk, her eyes bright. "Your mother would be proud," Greta said softly. "I am proud." Jorin knelt beside her grandmother's chair and laid her head on the old woman's lap, feeling the frail hand settle on her hair. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Winter came gently that year. The dye house was warm and well stocked, the cottage snug and secure, and Jorin and Marcus settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They worked side by side, her hands in his, her knowledge and his strength, and together they created cloth that was sought after across the region. Greta passed away in her sleep on the first night of December, peacefully, with Jorin and Marcus keeping vigil beside her. They buried her in the small graveyard at the edge of the village, under a stone that bore her name and the words Master Dyer. Jorin grieved, but she did not despair. Her grandmother had lived a long life, and she had seen Jorin settled and happy, and that was enough. Spring came, and with it a new kind of joy. Jorin discovered she was pregnant in March, and Marcus was so overcome that he lifted her off her feet and spun her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. They prepared the small room under the eaves, the one that had been Jorin's, and filled it with soft blankets and carved toys, and when their son was born in October, they named him Zane Reed. He had his mother's green skin and his father's brown eyes, and when he smiled, tiny tusks showed at the corners of his mouth. Jorin held him and wept with happiness, and Marcus kissed her forehead and whispered that they had made something beautiful. The years that followed were not always easy. There were hard winters and failed harvests, illnesses and injuries, moments of doubt and fear. But through it all, Jorin and Marcus stood together, their love a constant, steady flame that warmed them both. Jorin's dye house became known throughout the region, and her work was sought after by merchants and nobility alike. She trained apprentices, passing on the knowledge her grandmother had given her, and she took pride in watching them grow and flourish. Marcus expanded his farm, and together they built a life that was full and rich and deeply satisfying. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the work was done and Zane was asleep and the house was still, Jorin would sit with Marcus by the fire and remember the day she had meant to say thank you and kissed him instead. She would think about how terrified she had been, how sure that she had ruined everything, and she would marvel at how wrong she had been. Because that kiss, awkward and impulsive and entirely unplanned, had been the beginning of everything good in her life. It had been the moment she stopped running and started living, the moment she realized that she was worthy of love and capable of courage. And every time Marcus looked at her, his eyes warm and steady and full of affection. She was reminded that sometimes the best things in life began with a single, terrifying leap of faith. Jorin Thane had meant to say thank you, and instead she had kissed the farmer and run back inside. But she had not stayed hidden. She had come back out and she had spoken and she had loved, and in doing so, she had found a happiness she had never dared to dream of. And that, she thought, was the greatest gift of all.